It was a dark and stormy night in the small town of Millfield, and 16-year-old Jenny was babysitting for the Johnsons. She had heard the rumors about a weirdo who was calling babysitters at midnight, while they were in the house alone with children. Stories were going around about the bizarre sounds and ominous things he would say. But of course, Jenny didn't think anything of it, and after a busy evening watching the energetic Johnson twins, she'd all but forgotten about it. When she finally settled onto the Johnsons' couch to watch a movie, the phone rang. Jenny picked it up, expecting it to be her mom checking in on her. But there was no response when she answered, only a strange, chaotic background noise that sounded like distant screaming, tortured moaning voices, and static. After a few seconds of silence, a voice spoke, and it sent chills down Jenny's spine.
"I can hear the earth shifting beneath my feet. It's getting restless,"
the voice said. Time seemed to stand still.
Hello?
Jenny whispered into the phone with a shaking voice.
"There's a door in my dreams that leads to nowhere. I wonder what would happen if I open it."
The voice was strangely lyrical, almost like a child speaking in a sing-song voice. Except it was deep and intimidating as well. Then the midnight caller began to scream. Jenny dropped the phone and it clattered to the floor. The line disconnected as soon as it fell. This wasn't a normal prank call. She tried to tell herself that it was just a coincidence, that the screaming was coming from somewhere else, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The following Friday, a young lady named Alicia was babysitting at the home of the Fredericks. A different family, a different house, a different babysitter. But, at the stroke of midnight, she received a phone call.
"The stars are speaking to me tonight, telling me secrets that only the void can hold."
Alicia had heard all the stories. Her heart began to flutter.
"Who is this jerk face?"
She snarled into the phone. Alicia was a little braver than most.
"The clock strikes 13 and the moon turns blue. Do you feel the chill creeping up your spine?"
said the eerie caller. Alicia demanded once again that the caller identify himself. But instead he said,
"I see you. I like your shiny brown hair."
Then he began to scream. The most terrible thing about it was that Alicia could hear the scream coming through the phone. And coming from inside the house. Alicia swiftly hung up the phone. She called the police, and they came to search the house, but they found nothing. There was no sign of a break-in, and no one was hiding in the house. But the screaming continued, and it seemed to be coming from inside Alicia's head. She went to sleep in her own bed later, sobbing and clamping her hands over her ears, but it was no use. The midnight caller had gotten into Alicia's head. Yet another Friday came and found yet another high schooler babysitting for another family in another house. The scene was different, but the situation was unfortunately similar. At the stroke of midnight, the telephone rang out into the quiet night. Melanie picked it up, expecting it to be Mrs. Marcus, informing her they were on the way home. Instead, there was strange jumbled chaotic noise and quiet distant wailing screams. A strange voice said,
"I heard the whispers of the dead last night. They spoke of things we can't even imagine."
Melanie's heart practically stopped. She was so instantly terrified that she couldn't even speak. Her throat felt as though it had caught fire with her voice stuck inside.
"Melanie,"
said the sing-song voice.
"Once saw a tree with eyes. It looked at me and blinked before disappearing into the mist."
Then the screaming began. The Marcuses reported home moments later, and they found Melanie screaming. Their own daughter had been awoken by the screams and was in hysterics because her own babysitter seemed to have gone crazy. The Marcuses called the police, wondering if something had happened in their absence. Then they called Melanie's parents. Eventually, the group of adults managed to calm Melanie, but she would not speak on what had happened. She would not speak at all. About anything. Over the next few days, Melanie heard more and more stories about the midnight caller. Babysitters around town reported receiving strange calls, all with the same chaotic background noise and eerie phrases. And then, one by one, the babysitters began to disappear. The police were baffled. There was no sign of foul play, and no one had any leads. But the townspeople knew the truth. They knew that the midnight caller was behind it all. Melanie became terrified. Even though she had still not spoken, and her parents still didn't know what had happened on the night of their daughter's terrible screaming. Once the disappearances began, they put the pieces together, and they were desperate to protect their precious, frightened, lost child. Some people claimed to have seen him lurking in the shadows, a tall, gaunt figure with glowing eyes and a twisted smile. Others said that he was a ghost, haunting the town with his eerie calls. Melanie didn't know what to believe. All she knew was that she couldn't shake the feeling that the midnight caller was still out there, watching her. One night, a few months after the first call had been reported, and a few weeks after the first disappearance, Melanie was babysitting again. She wanted to put the terrible events behind her. She'd found a new family to babysit for, the Allens. They only had one child, a baby. Which was perfect. She still hadn't spoken, but the new family perceived her silence as politeness, and liked her for it. She had tried to convince herself that the midnight caller was just a hoax, that there was no such thing as ghosts or supernatural beings. But then, midnight came and the phone rang. Melanie hesitated for a moment, but then she picked it up. The same chaotic background noise filled her ear, and she could hear the eerie voice on the other end.
The walls are closing in. Can't you feel it? They're getting closer and closer, suffocating us with their concrete embrace.
The voice said, and then the screaming came. That awful screaming that hadn't left her troubled mind since the first time she'd heard it. Melanie felt a chill run down her spine. She tried to hang up the phone, but it wouldn't disconnect. And then she heard something that made her blood run cold. The screaming was coming from inside the house. Melanie panicked. She grabbed the Allen's baby and ran out of the house. She planned to run to the neighbors, but something unexplainable caused her to stop. She stood clutching the baby to her bare feet in the cold damp grass. Her pounding heart suddenly slowed down. Her breathing slowed down. It was as though something called her. She turned and went back into the house. Melanie gathered all her courage and slowly made her way upstairs. She could hear footsteps coming from one of the bedrooms, and as she cautiously opened the door, she was met with a frightening sight. A man, tall and thin, dressed in tattered, dirty clothing. His hair was wiry and greasy, and his gaunt face was twisted with insanity. And he was holding a bloody knife.
"I'm Samuel,"
he said in the haunting sing-song voice that had tormented her on the phone. He turned to face Melanie, his eyes wild with madness.
"You shouldn't have come back,"
he whispered, lunging towards her with the knife. Melanie screamed and ran towards the door, but Samuel was too fast. He caught up with her and plunged the knife into her back. She fell to the ground, gasping for breath as Samuel stood over her, grinning maniacally.
"You were always meant to be my final act,"
he said, his voice cold and detached.
"The perfect ending to my masterpiece."
And with that, Samuel disappeared into the night, along with his two captors, cold, silent, and dead. Later, when the Allens came home, they found the front door ajar. They found their baby, and their babysitter were gone. Nothing was left behind except for blood. After the incident, the police launched a full-scale investigation into the midnight caller, determined to bring him to justice. Once they could finally trace the calls, they combed through every inch of Samuel's terribly filthy apartment, searching for clues that would lead them to his whereabouts. What they found was a treasure trove of disturbing artifacts, including countless newspaper clippings detailing the deaths of his victims, creepy sketches, and drawings of his twisted creations, and a diary filled with dark and disturbing musings about his obsession with death and the macabre. It soon became clear that Samuel had been driven to madness by a traumatic event from his childhood. He had grown up in an abusive household, where he was often beaten and neglected by his parents. His only escape had been his art, which he had used to channel his pain and anger into something productive. But after a tragic accident claimed the life of his younger sister, Samuel's world had been shattered. It was an accident caused by a careless babysitter who had not properly watched his sister while she was in the bath. So she drowned. He had descended into a spiral of depression and despair, and his art had taken a dark and twisted turn. He had become obsessed with death and the afterlife, and had started to create terrifying creatures that he believed would help him achieve his ultimate goal, to transcend his mortal existence and become a god. The police were never able to track down Samuel, and he remained a mystery to the end. But the legend of the Midnight Caller lived on, haunting the town and serving as a cautionary tale for generations to come.
In the dead of night, when the world is still, and the moon casts shadows long and chill, beware the caller on the line, whose words are twisted and voice divine. Samuel is his name, a man of art, whose mind is warped and soul is dark. He whispers secrets in your ear, and fills your heart with dread and fear. The call comes from within your home, and echoes through your halls and dome. His laughter rings within your ear, a sound that chills and fills with fear. He speaks of death and twisted things, of monsters lurking in the wings. His words are poison, his thoughts are foul, a madness that he can't control. Beware the midnight caller's spell, for in his web you'll surely dwell. His voice will haunt you through the night, a terror that will never take flight.